My name is Laila Lalami, as you heard, and I'm a novelist and essayist, and it's really my great pleasure to be with you here tonight moderating this conversation. Last year, while diligently avoiding work, I happened upon a 3-minute video clip of a macaque playing a game of ping pong with a computer entirely hands-free thanks to a Neuralink implant. The Neuralink paired the monkey's consciousness with the computer in the same way that a phone might be paired with a Bluetooth speaker. Consciousness, which we think of as a deeply private domain, perhaps even mystical, may someday soon be available to others around us with our consent, or possibly without it. But what technology promises, fiction has already explored. In Jennifer Egan's The Candy House, a tech mogul builds a cube that can hold every memory you've ever had. In Sheila Heti's Pure Color, a grieving woman's consciousness joins her father's inside a leaf. In these novels, readers are able to enter the emotional world of a range of characters, the emotional worlds of a range of characters whose memories and consciousnesses are shared or manipulated or physically migrated. How do they navigate romantic relationships, sex, or friendships? How do they cope with loss? How do they view art and creation? These are some of the questions at the heart of these books. It's my great pleasure and privilege to be here with Jennifer Egan and Sheila Heti, two visionary writers who've brought their considerable talents to bear on the question of human consciousness. To my left, though by no means politically, Jennifer Egan is the author of several novels and a short story collection. Her 2017 novel, Manhattan Beach, was chosen as New York City's One Book, One New York Read. Her previous novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad, won the 2011 Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Also a journalist, she has written frequently in the New York Times Magazine, and she recently completed a term as president of PEN America. Her new novel, The Candy House, a sibling to A Visit from the Goon Squad, was published in April. Sheila Heti is the author of 10 books, including the novels Motherhood and How Should a Person Be, which New York Magazine deemed one of the new classics of the 21st century. She was named one of the new vanguard by the New York Times book critics, who, along with a dozen other magazines and newspapers, chose Motherhood as a top book of 2018. Sheila Heti's books have been translated into 25 languages. Her newest novel, Pure Color, was published in February, and her children's book with Esme Shapiro, A Garden of Creatures, is being published this week. May I ask you to welcome them tonight with a round of applause. We'll be in conversation for about 45 minutes, after which I will open it up to the Q&A. If you wish to ask a question, please use the microphone over here to my left, and please keep your mask on as you ask your questions. A book signing will follow the event, thanks to our bookstore partner, The Strand, and you can get your books signed over there behind the stage. All right, so Jenny, let me begin with you. I'm still getting used to these glasses, so it's just been, let's see how that goes. In The Candy House, your character, Bix Putin, a tech entrepreneur, creates a new software called Own Your Unconscious, which allows people to externalize their memories. That is, every experience they've ever had is downloaded onto a cube and thereafter shareable at will with others. I'm very curious, what drew you to the idea of externalizing memory? So much of that, what happens in the book, hinges on this particular technological innovation, and I'm wondering what got you interested in it.
You know, it actually came about sort of a little bit by accident, or it was one of the last things to fall into place. I knew that I had a guy who was, a very successful tech guy. I kind of posit that he invented social media already, and he's having a midlife crisis, doesn't know what his new idea is going to be. And I wrote a chapter that I had fun with, in which he goes in disguise, because he's so famous that he can't really just like attend a discussion group without derailing the discussion. But he goes in disguise to this academic discussion group hoping for some kind of inspiration, which already seemed sort of funny to me. And then at a later point, he ends up on the subway with one of the people who was in the group, and he now finds the duplicitousness of being in disguise even more uncomfortable. And she senses that and basically confronts him and says, "Can you swear that you are who you say you are?" And of course, he can't. So he comes clean and tells her who he is, and she doesn't believe him. And they have this sort of ridiculous interaction where she stares at him and says, "You don't even look like him, you don't sound like him." So all that stuff was the fun of writing that chapter. What I didn't know was what he would actually invent. And it came about really inductively through other stories that I was telling. There were little hints of there's a guy who works in tech in the 2030s who is madly in love with one of his coworkers, and very much wants to make her fall in love with him. And he kind of speculates that he could view her memories and see what her sexual tastes are, for example, or just what she cares about, but that would be a violation, and he can't do that. And I remember when I wrote that, I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting, so that's possible in this world. Those were the kinds of little hints that made me ultimately realize what the shape of the invention would be.
I love that. I love how it comes about so organically in the process of creation. And it reminds me of something that I think Ray Bradbury said, which is that your intuition knows what it's doing, so get out of the way. So it's kind of...
It certainly knows better than I do, so I do my best to get out of the way.
So Sheila, in Pure Color, you approach memory from a very different perspective. Your character, Mira, a student of art criticism, loses her father, with whom she was very close, and as she grieves, she begins to reflect on the nature of life, on the fact that all life is a first draft, which you call God's first draft. After Mira's father dies, his consciousness and hers too end up in a leaf. They turn sunlight and water into oxygen, which is another existence, another draft. I wondered how the book began in your mind as well. If you could take us to the moment of inception. When did you decide this is a book that I'm going to write, that I'm invested in writing?
It's hard to say. I would have a different answer before this week, I think, but I was looking through, I had a reason to have to look through some old notes from when I was writing How Should a Person Be, which I started in 2005. And I saw that in those notes I have this folder, and on the front it says, Sheila turns into a tree. And I had no memory that I had that thought back then, that was a chapter, that was anything that I was thinking of. So, in the book she becomes a leaf. And it kind of made me think like maybe all your creative ideas are sort of in you eternally, and they just come out at different times, or they express themselves differently at different times, because the moment of inception just feels like often an inevitability or a kind of recognition, or as you're talking about, Jenny, you see clues. It's almost like it's already there and you just have to figure out okay, where is it, or something like that. So I don't know how far back an idea goes.
No, I think that makes perfect sense, what you're saying. It makes perfect sense. So both of these books have very interesting narrative architectures. Jenny, in the Candy House, chapters are told from the points of view of many different characters, some of whom may be familiar to those of you who've read A Visit from the Goon Squad. I hasten to add that you don't need to have read that book to love this one, to read or love this one. And I mentioned Bix Putin, the tech mogul, but there are other characters like a music producer, a math geek, an artist, a lawyer, a spy/assassin. And I'd love for the audience to get a taste of what your writing is like. Would you mind reading something very short for us?
Sure. Okay, hold on. So I'm going to read from a chapter that's called Bright Day, and the only thing you really need to know is that Roxy is at her methadone clinic, where there is a weekly Dungeons and Dragons game, which she doesn't participate in but loves to watch. And the game, the dungeon master, Chris, keeps trying to get her to play. Chris beckons Roxy with an empty character sheet and says, "What do you say, Rox? Is today the day?" She shakes her head. She would play her opposite, a D&D version of her 16-year-old self, a girl with molten ardor roiling in her chest and stomach and groin, who was unafraid to hold the stare of any man daring a result. What would that be in D&D terms, and how can she ask without embarrassing herself? Roxy lost her virginity at 13 to her first boyfriend, Terrence Chen, who was a junior in high school, and then she dumped Terrence and went on in search of men in their 20s and 30s who could rise to her occasion. She took pride in her mishaps. She'd been punched, had her stomach pumped, yet her face in the mirror looked dewy and untouched, its bird-like angles bewitching even to herself. She was gamine, her mother said. There wasn't an ounce of fat on her body. Roxy had located Terrence Chen again, the internet version of Terrence, when she first moved to Northern California in her early 30s in the brand new millennium. Everyone was finding everyone on the internet then. Terrence, it turned out, had also moved to the Bay Area and was a veterinarian in Marin County. He looked buff and handsome on his website, smiling over a foam of golden retriever fur. And he appeared also to have several children and a wife whose hair was the same color as the golden retrievers. Roxy toyed with the idea of bringing her new rescue kitten to see Terrence, the veterinarian, despite the inconvenience of schlepping across the bay to his practice. But no, she decided, not yet. She needed to swan through the door to Terrence's clinic, a clear winner. At that point, she was still pretty. Her sisters had paid to restore her smile after the loss of several teeth and to straighten out her nose from a bad break. She was slim and stylish in her 30s, could still dance, but she was also grappling with a heroin habit and had a dozen years behind her that Terrence would likely regard as lost. She needed to at least match and, better yet, exceed Terrence's high life score before casting her somewhat less pretty but undeniably pretty self in his path. Fame would do it. Roxy had always believed she would be famous, and others had too. And when she first moved to San Francisco and tracked down Terrence, almost 25 years ago now, fame was not yet out of the question.
So that was really beautiful, and it's actually one of my favorite chapters in that book, and it's a moment in the book when I just had to close it and sit back and think about the sort of how you come about, for example, here with the Dungeons and Dragons. And do you play Dungeons and Dragons?
I don't play Dungeons and Dragons. One of my kids got really into it and hosted a weekly game at our house, and I would bake for them, partly so that I could eavesdrop.
And observe.
And so I thought a lot about a lot of aspects of it were really fascinating. One of which was how important numbers are to that game. Numbers, measurements, assigning values to things, and yet the game itself is, unpredictable and can go in any direction. So that paradox really interested me. And I did do some LARPing myself, live action role playing.
Oh.
Very reluctantly and according to my son, extremely unsuccessfully.
I think pics or it didn't happen.
But at least I got a flavor of it, and it was amazing. A Girl Scout camp in New Jersey where something called Night Realms happens, which is a monthly gathering of people who take on other identities of creatures and humans, and and enact a story that's somewhat scripted for them, but mostly just free form. And it was really fascinating from a narrative perspective.
Yeah, and it's great because it ended up in in the book. So Sheila, the narrative in Pure Color is also fragmented, but in completely different ways. And you begin by recasting the world for us using an entirely different cosmology, I guess would be, or ontology would be the word, likening some people to birds who are interested in beauty and order, others to fish who are concerned with fairness and justice, and yet others to bears who are able to forge connections and hold people close. You narrate the story in the third person and in the first person, and at one point in dialogue between Mira and her father, dialogue that, as I mentioned, takes place inside the leaf. Could you read an excerpt for us, please, just to
Sure.
give the audience a sense of the beauty of this book?
Yeah, so there are two excerpts that you were interested in me reading. So I'll read this one where Mira's father has died, and she felt like she didn't spend enough time with him while he was alive, and she realizes that when he dies. And then this is the beginning of the next section of the book. Decades ago, on a beautiful summer day, upon an old waterlogged tree, Mira sat with her father and was warmed by the light of the sun. What was she hoping to find if she returned to that spot? She just wanted a little peace in her heart. She wondered if being there would bring her back to life, but none of their good earlier feelings returned as she sat there, only her failure at not having made things right with him. She threw her heart out. She threw out her brain, her arms, her hair, her feet. She threw all of herself into the water, hoping the lake would catch her, save her, hold her, and return her refreshed to the shore. It did not. She went down to the water, stripped off her clothes, and went in. It was cold. She had once feared swimming in it. As kids, they had been told that the water was polluted. But then when they got older, the adults said no, it wasn't polluted, and it never had been. She must have transformed as the sunlight shone down onto the earth like a golden ball, or the tides must have washed her back onto the shore, under a branch, which is where some part of her rose up, up, up into a leaf in a tree. One day the lake would flood the whole city from the ice caps melting into the sea, and the whole city would be destroyed, and anyone she had ever called a friend, and that log, and this leaf, and everyone. She was drawn up into a leaf in a tree by the lake, where there was a small cluster of trees near the sand. The log beneath it had been broken off in a storm, and had washed up and lodged there below it, very old, waterlogged, and finally dry. It was used as a bench by many people, and it had been used as a bench for years. It was on this log that she had sat with her father, who she had loved perhaps more than she had loved anyone. They had sat looking out at the lake, at the condo towers as they were being built. But the first time they sat by the water, no towers had yet been built. Back then, long ago, there was nothing by the water but seaweed and pop bottles washed up on the sand. As soon as she was in the leaf, she knew she had made a mistake. She had wanted to go to a better place, but her spirit got caught in a leaf. That it could be contained within a leaf made her wonder at how small her spirit was, when she had been so sure in life that her spirit was large. She was caught in the leaf, and inside her there was an awareness that something had gone wrong. There, beneath her, people were strolling, people who didn't look up at a leaf. Even if they had looked up, could she have conveyed her message? She could not communicate with the other leaves. Were there spirits trapped in them too? How much lonelier she was in the leaf than she had been as a person anywhere. Soon she couldn't remember what her problems in life had been. What had made her so sad and guilty that the solution was to go into a leaf? Then there was the frustration of having no legs, so no way to walk away from this new life, this position in the universe. Now she could do nothing but convert sunlight into food, and even that wasn't very much fun.
So thank you very much for that. I imagine that this isn't the kind of thing that, I was going to ask Jenny this as well, but this isn't the kind of thing that you can observe and kind of, draw from, something that you've observed or from research or any external observation like that. And I'm just curious about how you write these sections that had, when I was reading them, they had such an effect on me. My father died during the pandemic, and it was really, reading your book it just really had such an effect on me. It was the first time that I read anything that made me feel like things are good. I don't know how to explain it, but it made me feel like I was seen and somebody understood what that process was like. And I was wondering if you could take us through how you kind of put it together, because I just was amazed by it.
Well, with this part, I remember speaking it into a microphone. That's how I wrote this section, and I would type it out. Like I would be walking, and I would speak it into a microphone, like my phone, and then type it out when I got home, and then I put the writing through a text-to-speech software program and downloaded that. And then I remember for like 3 weeks in my whole entire life, which was that summer, I went jogging and running, and I would listen to it as I was running. And I felt like somehow, like moving through the city, being outside, hearing the words, it was really clear when I got home, I would remember, okay, that part didn't work. I usually don't have such an elaborate process, but I think writing about this most profound experience of my life, which was losing my father, it was sort of like I needed a different process. I needed something a little bit more oblique, maybe, because I couldn't just sit down and write about it I couldn't just sit and type it at my computer where I was typing my emails.
Right. Well, I mean, the effect is, it's a miracle. It's really a beautiful book. So, Jenny, you published Manhattan Beach in between A Visit from the Goon Squad and Candy House. And I'm wondering what it's like working with characters from 2 books ago, with this one, So was it easier to write, for example, Benny Salazar or Sasha or any of the ones that we've met before?
Well, I started those two. I started The Candy House and Manhattan Beach at the same time, and I worked on both first drafts for about 2 years, actually. So I actually had a lot of first draft material of this book that I hadn't even typed up. It was because I handwrite fiction, my first drafts, basically because I feel like I get, back to the quote, I get to my intuition and I get away from my reason, which is really important for me to do. And so I took it all back out after I had finished Manhattan Beach in 2016, but somehow I'd been making notes all the way, and the characters felt like they had never really left me. Even on my book tour for Goon Squad, I was actually working on the chapter about a spy in The Candy House. So there were certain events that, for example, there's a drowning that takes place in Goon Squad. One of the last chapters that I wrote, an undergraduate at NYU, and goes swimming. Well, he follows his friend, also an undergrad, into the East River, and he drowns. And that was one of the last chapters I wrote, so I didn't end up exploring that event anywhere else in the book. And it's kind of the nature of a book in which every chapter has its own point of view and sort of inner world, that each one introduces a lot of new people that I could conceivably follow. And I'm fine with that open-endedness, but somehow this drowning felt so big that I felt like I can't just leave it there. I have to revisit this through the people who were close to it, the guy who went swimming, and Bix, the tech entrepreneur, the guy who becomes a tech entrepreneur, but at that point is just an electrical engineering grad student who was the last person to see them. So I think in some ways it was really this sense that I had a kind of responsibility to some of what I had introduced, and I needed to look at the aftermath of it. And in fact, both Bix and Drew, the guy who was swimming, used the consciousness machine to view those last moments that they spend with Rob, who ends up drowning. So we're back there, the reader is back there in that scene through their memories, because they want to witness it from their adult perspective.
Right. And Sheila, do you find that these characters stay with you long after you finish the book, or you're done with what happened in pure color, you don't see yourself revisiting that? Or maybe it's happened with one of your previous books.
I don't really experience them as characters. Like, I don't really feel like they have lives apart from me, or apart from like what I put down. Like, what I put down, there isn't more that they're experiencing that I don't write down.
Right. So there's no sense of going back to that.
Can I interject a question? Because I'm very curious, Sheila, I'm enjoying your book very much. And one thing I was so struck by in the early pages is that there's so much mention of a God. There's a lot of use of the word God. And I was struck by it because it seemed really unusual to me to find that in literary fiction. And part of it is you're suggesting a whole cosmology. There's a kind of myth, of an origin myth. But I'm kind of curious, now that you talk about your process and the way you think about characters, how did the God character end up in this book?
That's a good question. I mean, they've all been good questions. I don't know what I can say about that, but I think as I get older, I become, because I'm Jewish, but I grew up in a very atheistic household where anyone who believed in God was an idiot. Like, you have to be complete. My father's an electrical engineer, like Bix, and that's a very rationalist view of the world often. I think I become, because I could never think about it when I was young, it was sort of like repressed or whatever. I think I'm thinking about it more as I get older, and I just think that, like, if I don't know what I mean by God, but I feel like if I write about it, I'll figure it out. Like, if I'll get closer and closer to what that word might mean. But I think that it's not so different to talk about a God as an artist, because you also are creating worlds, and you can have empathy for a God figure as somebody who tries to create. Like, I feel like there's, like, God actually, well, it's C.S. Lewis, actually, when I was reading C.S. Lewis on a train, he said, if there's one thing that we know for sure about God, it's that he is a great artist. And that stuck with me for, like, I probably read that 15 years ago, and that just stuck with me, the idea of God as an artist. So it seems like an easier character it seems easier to write artists. And that's like the best artist you can write about, or the worst, depending on how you see the world.
And this is a question for both of you. Both of your books use this sort of what I would call a fragmented narrative, right? So different characters, different uses of points of view, different timelines. How do you keep the book like having a sort of like integrity as a book? Or perhaps that's not something you think about at all. You just kind of write it as it comes.
I do think about it. Well, it has to ultimately have that, or it won't be a book. I wasn't sure. I gave myself full permission not to actually publish this material as a book, because I knew unless it did feel like it fused into a larger story that really had integrity, I wouldn't want to. I could just publish the pieces individually. I think for me, it's very much a case of, I love the idea of you dictating work and then hearing it played back to you. That sort of call and response with the work itself is something I really relate to. And I feel like I learn a lot from what I've already done and what it feels like it might be. And also, I have a writing group that I rely on pretty heavily, and I actually dedicated this book to them. And through the pandemic, we met every Sunday on Zoom. It was such a heartbeat through the pandemic. And some of the insights that were really important came there. And one thing that I'm remembering is that, as I was still trying to figure out what Bix's invention was, and I had these little glimmers that people are able to somehow view other people's thoughts technologically, that there's some sort of machine, but we don't really know what it is. And I brought in a chapter that's a stream of consciousness from a 13-year-old, very anxious young girl who is freaking out about popularity, about where she stands socially, a feeling of that she's actually disappearing and dissolving because her best friend is rejecting her, and it's for her it's extremely serious and it's very interior. And when I read that chapter to my writing group, David, the only man in our group, said, "Oh, that's really interesting. It's almost like you're using that machine that came up in that other chapter to show us what it's like inside her mind." And I remember that was really a moment where I thought, wait a minute, there's something I have to really pay attention to there. So those insights ultimately, I think, helped me work toward a kind of fusion. But I also get a lot of feedback, and even when I turned the book in and got notes from lots of people, including my editor, it still needed more. The integration part wasn't complete, and that was a little the same with Goon Squad. Like the actual structural integrity with books like this, where the chronology doesn't play a part. Is sometimes the last thing to really fall into place. And I think that it's partly because, since I'm not using chronology, it's really the inner logic of the work itself that I have to, and the role of satisfying curiosity, which is really the organizing principle of these books. In some ways, that is really the last thing I'm able to see clearly.
Yeah, I mean, it's... the way you talk about things falling into place is because I think my books are also not... Well, this book is more chronological than others have been, but then I feel like the narrative in this case comes out of the emotional tone of the book. And I kept thinking I was done, and then 3 months would pass, and I would be in a different stage emotionally, and I would think, oh no, actually that's not done. There has to be this other part. So unlike other books I've written, I would keep adding on to the end. Like it just kept getting, the longer. And then I actually gave the book into my editor and my agent, and it was done. But I had this feeling inside me, like it's not done. Like and like it was like this deep knowledge that you kind of like don't want to accept because it means more work, but I knew it. And I had just read a book by a contemporary who I really admire, and I got to the end of the book, and I just was I felt I was so with the book, and then when I finished the book, I just felt enraged. I felt she didn't finish the book. And every friend I talked to for like 3 weeks after that, all I could talk about was like how she didn't finish her book, and like why didn't she wait another 6 months, and why didn't she figure out her book, and it ruined the whole entire book. And then I realized, like, why do I care about this person's book? And then when I was feeling like my book wasn't done, I was thinking, oh, like that was all like a message to a future self, like don't be that person that you would complain about. Finish your book. And I live with my partner, but I was on my own for a few days, and I thought, okay, now I'm going to finish it. And I just decided, I'm going to finish it, even though I didn't know what that meant to finish it. And I wrote, and I just thought, can you do this? And I thought, yes. And like, I wrote the last 3 pages, and it was as if that ending made the whole book make sense to me. And again, like my answer to your first question, like, was it there all along? Like, is the ending, like, was the ending, because it made the whole book make sense. It just told me what the whole book actually was, like who was speaking the whole book, who the book was being spoken to. So I think like there's things that you can't let yourself know when you're writing, and I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
And then I was like, okay, it's done. Like, and then I felt good.
I understand. I love that. It's one of the things, my favorite thing about writing is kind of writing and then discovering something that deep inside you, your consciousness or your unconscious knew, but you didn't let yourself kind of realize, and so you have to find your way through it. Jenny, you were mentioning earlier the pandemic, and so I'm just wondering, Sheila, did you write this book during the pandemic?
I started writing it in early 2018.
I remember when the pandemic, when we thought it was going to be in just a few weeks, or maybe a few months, the New York Times did a piece on it says here in my notes, on the 1-year anniversary, and they were asking a bunch of artists about their creativity during a very bad year, and I guess this was when people thought that it would be over that year. And so anyway, they had people saying, I wrote, tons of new material, I made music, I created 2 podcasts, and so on. And my favorite answer was Tracy Letts, who basically said, I've made nothing. I was like, that was me, I did nothing the first year. And so I wondered about if you could talk and share with the audience, because all of us have this, for the first time, something that all of us have gone through. Like, how is it like to get yourself to write and to get a book and produce it during the pandemic and have it come out and be able to share it with audiences? I'd love to know what that process is like.
I mean, I felt so lucky that I could do my work. My husband is in the theater, and his whole world just stopped. He had a show open, it had to close. And, he and all of his fellow artists were just stymied and unable to do their work. And his theater was a food bank staging area, and they made masks. And, so I felt like the luckiest person in the world that I could actually do this work. I mean, I've always felt very lucky that I could do it anywhere, anytime, anyhow, but more than ever. And I think maybe because I don't write about myself, and what I'm doing rarely has an immediate connection to the world around me, that's another lucky thing, because I was already working on this material, and it didn't really matter that the world had changed, because it was easy. Even though a lot of the book takes place in the future, I already felt a kind of chasm in American life. I had been writing this originally during the Obama years, and then I picked it back up in 2016, and I felt like there was already a before and an after. So somehow having that be the pandemic felt really easy. And I also feel very lucky that I've actually been able to travel and meet readers and stay with family and friends and kind of get back into the world. I got very lucky with when this book came out. But I guess my overall feeling is just we're lucky because of the solitude of what we do and the fact that we don't need much to do it.
I mean, I did write most of the book before the pandemic, so I don't feel like, those 2 years I was writing this book. I tried to write other things, like I was trying to write criticism, and I was trying to write stories, and I think the only time I ever wrote that badly was the summer I lived in New York. I couldn't write when I lived here either, because to me, the noise of the culture was so loud, and I live in Toronto, and it's a very different tone. I kind of think like we are like plants, like you grow into who you are in the soil that is your home. So like I can think there in a way that I couldn't think here. And same with the pandemic, it was like a soil in which I couldn't think. And I would try to write. I wrote this review of Annie Ernaux's books. I read all her books, and I wrote this review, and I sent it to the editor of the journal, and it took her 3 months to get back to me because it was the early days of the pandemic, and I got it back, and it was completely incoherent what I had written, and I had this kind of feeling like one makes work actually for the culture. And as much as you're writing it for yourself, you're also writing it for the world that it's going to be in. And the world that it's going to be in is a place where people are talking to each other and going out to coffee and going out for drinks and having parties. And even a piece of criticism like falls into a world of conversation. And during the pandemic, it wasn't a world of conversation. And I felt like I was writing for no space. And so nothing I wrote during that time worked.
It's very interesting. I just want to signal to the audience that we will be opening it up for Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, please speak into that microphone. And as a reminder, you have to keep your mask on. And while people are walking over to that microphone, I can ask you another question. Jenny earlier was talking about how she has a group of writer friends. Do you share your work also with other writers and get feedback and incorporate that as well?
Yeah, I do. I don't think you can see it without seeing it through other people's eyes. So I share it a lot. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Oh, I was just going to say one thing that's interesting about the way our writing group functions, and I was struck by what you described in your process, is that we only read aloud. So the experience is purely auditory, and there's no homework. We all have the experience together, and it's a great way of eliciting a spontaneous reaction that seems to really focus on the important things and not get caught up in the little things. And also what I find so helpful is that it makes me attend to the rhythm and the sound of the language in a way that ultimately I have to. I mean, that's a big part of what makes writing powerful. And it can take a really long time. Like when I read the chapter now called Lulu the Spy, which was the first one I wrote, which was published as a novella in 2012, it took me like an hour and 20 minutes to read it. And I was breathless. I felt like I needed an oxygen machine. And when I was done, I was like, and there was kind of a slightly deadly silence in the room. And I thought, oh my God. And one of the writing group members, Ruth, said, "It may be too long."
That's a great story.
So, yeah.
How many people are in your group?
6.
All right, so for the first question, yes, please.
I really appreciate the way that both of you talk about your writing process. I have a question for Sheila. I have a question for Sheila about your process, or 2 questions. The first is why you think that if you're aware of why you needed a different process when you were writing about your father, and you were running and speaking, and how that was different, and why you think you felt that you needed to do it differently. And then my second process is on your beautiful essays in the New York Times, those pieces where you drew from your journal. And I'm really curious about what you decided to include and what you left out, and how structuring it according to the alphabet, like how that changed the ideas, or what you learned, or what kind of appeared. So I'm sorry that's so many layers. Questions.
So your first question was why I wrote differently. I mean, it's not a decision ahead of time. You just try different things out, and some things work and some things don't work. So it's all just experimenting and seeing, this is working, this is not working. So I didn't go in thinking I'm going to have to write this book differently.
Do you have any thoughts about why that particular experience or situation kind of required a different process?
I mean, after my father died, I felt like I was high for a year. It required a different process because I was different. My brain was different, my spirit was different. I just felt like I was on psychedelics or something. Like the whole world seemed like a different place to me. And so, yeah, I would have to write differently. I would probably had conversations differently. And then you asked about my project in the New York Times, which was, for those who don't know, I had 10 years of diaries and of my journals, and I put the sentences in alphabetical order using Excel, and then edited so that there was some kind of sense of flow. But basically, week 1 was A, B, C, D, and every sentence is alphabetical. And it just was a different way of looking at 10 years of journals. And first of all, by alphabetizing them off, obviously you take out chronology, you take out story. And the amazing thing to me was how coherent it still was, nevertheless, because the self is itself, even over a 10-year span. I thought, I must have changed a lot over 10 years. But the fact that all the sentences fit together made me feel like I hadn't. And those were 10 of the most dramatic years of my life. Boyfriends, moving cities, so much. And yet still, it was the exact same person all the way through. So it was kind of depressing. I was like, I'm not going to write a diary anymore. I'm not even going to have any adventures anymore. Like, nothing changes anything. But it was like a kind of freeing feeling, like once you realize, well, I'm stuck being myself. So I think it was a good experience. And the way that I edited was just the way that you edit anything. Like, I just took out the less interesting sentences.
Beautiful.
That's a good
Thank
tip.
you.
Take out the less interesting sentences.
Hello. This question is mostly directed to Jennifer. Can you spill the tea on how you inhabit and voice such a multitude of characters? And to what extent does this have to do with you removing yourself from the characters and the book?
Well, I find character the hardest thing to explain in terms of my process. So I'll just describe the process, which is that I really start with time and place. That's the point of connection between what I'm doing and my own life knowingly. Of course, there end up being more connections than I want to admit when I look at it later. But so there will be a sense of atmosphere. So, for example, the 13-year-old, the hyper-anxious, popularity-obsessed 13-year-old, that really started with wanting to write about kind of a country club and I haven't spent a lot of time in country clubs, but I've spent a little bit. My grandparents belonged to one in Rockford, Illinois, and my father, whom I never lived with after age 2, but would visit in Chicago, he belonged to a country club. So in a kind of outsider way, I had a really strong sense of just the sensory experience of the grass, the sound of tennis balls, the sort of social hierarchies that I could perceive, even though I wasn't part of them really. So I started with that. And then it's very improvisational in that I just start writing. And I write by hand my first drafts, and I really only require of myself that I fill about 5 pages on a legal pad. And the idea is start and keep going. So again, very much like improvisation, I'm looking to find some kind of line of action and then just push as hard as I can into it. Keep going. And so that's sort of where the 13-year-old came along and everyone else in that piece. Then there's a lot of reflection and editing, frankly, many, many more drafts. And at that point, I'm really asking certain questions about I'm always wanting to be surprised. Like, I don't want something to happen that I could have thought of. And in fact, when I think I know where things are going, that hopefully means that I've eliminated those choices of where things will go. I'm always looking for contradictions, the ways in which people don't make sense, because I feel like we really are a product of our contradictions. And I'm always really interested in habits of mind, the way different consciousnesses organize reality. We know it's not the same for all of us, but we only really know what ours is like. And to me, the gift that fiction gives us is the experience of actually knowing how another mind organizes reality into language, into just perception. What are the structures through which we interpret everyday events? So those are the things I'm looking for, but the good moves usually happen very spontaneously, and then I just try to recognize them and do more of them.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I guess we can continue. They're being very shy. Let me see, what else could I ask you?
Well, I've got a question for you, Jenny. You have a question. Well, you ask your question first.
This kind of. Let me start. I don't want to break anything. I have a question kind of for both of you as writers. It's kind of a big question. You've sort of answered it, but I've been recently taking a class called Actually Writing by a poet and a memoirist that lives in the city. And she was saying that there's a point where, as writers, like I don't know how old you were when you just said, okay, this is it. This is who I am. I'm going to be a writer. And there's a certain sacrifice that you make to do that. And I wondered if you could talk about if there was a moment like that for you guys, or you just like, I'm just really curious about that. And I know you've also talked about your process, because I'm like, well, do you get up every morning at 5 o'clock and like, you know, circle the room 3 times?
Don't like those
and
people.
those are my questions.
We all know someone who gets up at 5 a.m. and drinks a pot of coffee and starts writing. We don't like that.
I feel I also spent a lot of time when I was a teenager reading the Paris Review interviews and just thinking, well, how do all these different writers make their work? Because I didn't know any writers growing up. And so I really wanted to learn how people do it. And what I learned from reading all those interviews is just like, oh, everyone does it differently, and everyone found their own process. And it taught me, like, oh, that's what you have to do. You have to figure out what's yours, and you're never going to be different from yourself. So I'm never going to be the person that gets up the same time every day, sits down at the desk, does the same thing every day, because I'm just more chaotic than that. And I don't always feel like writing, and I'm not the kind of person that's going to make myself do something I don't feel like doing. And so, like, you have to go with who you are. So I was like, okay, given what this is in my early 20s, I'm thinking this through, I want to be a writer. Given that that's what you want more than anything else is to write, you've got to be the best you can within the constraints of your character. And so for me, that meant really paying attention to when the feeling inside me of wanting to write was coming up, like paying attention, like physiologically, like, oh, I'm getting that feeling of like wanting to write. And my version of discipline was every time I feel like that, I have to write. So maybe I'm only going to feel like that every 2 weeks, but if I miss that moment, that to me is not fulfilling this desire to be the best I can. And that's always been the case, like ever since then. I'm just like, well, just pay attention to what that feeling is. And I think that idea that you have to do the same thing day after day, I tried that because I read this book, and I wish I could remember the writer, and then I read about him, and it was like he wrote 10,000 words a day or whatever it was, and I was like, well, I'm going to do that, and I did that. So I tried to be that kind of writer where I'm going to write every day. I'm going to write X thousand words a day. And I did that for a couple months, and at the end I had nothing. I had words on the page, but it was garbage. Like, it was not usable for me. So I think, whereas the other process is incredibly usable for me, because I kind of believe that when that feeling of wanting to write is coming up, it's because there's like a lot, maybe your dreams or your experiences or just like a lot of things have mixed together in an interesting way, and only in that moment will that interesting mixture come out. But if you miss it, if you go to the next day, well, you've had another dream, you don't have the same feelings. So yeah, that's what I figured out for myself.
It's so interesting to hear about that. It really is amazing how everyone is so different. I agree completely that the challenge is to find your process. And for me, it's in a way a little bit opposite, because if I wait until I feel like writing, I will never write. So discipline has got to be in place for me. But the discipline is, what I find most important is to be willing to write really badly. Because if I decide I have to write every day, I can't also say it has to be good. I mean, that's just impossible. So for me, it's about filling up pages and then having something to work with. And deciding that I'm going to fill up these pages and that I can let it be as bad as it can be. And I actually don't reread it, even when I finish. I only reread it the next day to get back into the flow. And my handwriting is so terrible that I'm not really reading much as I go. In fact, sometimes I can never read it. So it's really, that's to get into a kind of unconscious state where I'm really not judging what I'm doing, and I'm actually not even sure what I'm doing. Sometimes I think, oh, that was really good, and then when I read it the next day, I realize, no, it actually kind of wasn't. But other days that it feels like it was terrible, the next day I find things that are more interesting than I thought, and then the real test is when I ultimately type it up, and now I'm looking at it like a regular manuscript. So I agree totally. It's about identifying your process. I wish mine didn't involve handwriting. It's inefficient. Typing 28 legal pads full of handwriting that happened over the course of a year and a half is hell, but it's the only way that I can get the good stuff, and so I do it.
What about you, Laila?
Well, I was just going to say that I wish I were like Sheila, like writing in the way, but I think I'm more like Jennifer, and I think it's because of just the fact that I spent so much time in academia and in college, and so it's like that sort of training of always being at your computer every day. I think that's what really resonates the most for me. But so often I wish I were the other kind of writer and just write whenever inspiration strikes. There is another question. Yes, please.
Oh, hello? Okay. I kind of a simple question. I was just wondering, what was, for either of you or both of you, what was the purpose of wanting to write about memory? Is there a specific message you want to convey, or is it something that you felt like it's in your heart, or like what was the purpose for that?
Well, I think that I didn't think about it specifically in terms of writing about memories. I mean, what drives people to want to use this machine, which I actually describe more as externalizing consciousness rather than memory per se. But people are using it mostly to investigate what actually happened. And so, for example, there's a woman whose father, who revisits a day in her father's life when she was only 6 years old, and in fact she sees herself through his eyes as a 6-year-old. And it's a day that ends up being very important because it's 1965 and he's a very straight-laced businessman. He goes to a marijuana farm in a sort of beatnik enclave, and he is absolutely shocked, has never seen anything like this, and he returns home somewhat changed, and the marriage ends up ending, and so the daughter is really trying to understand her father and what it was like to be her father, which is one of those things we never know about any other person, but I think especially we don't know it about parents. We see them in a certain way. It's very hard to really imagine what it would be like to be them. So that people use the machine investigatively out of curiosity and not so much to relive or out of nostalgia, but really to bring a present day perspective to the past, to take it out of the realm of memory and have it as a present day experience.
This is a question for anyone who would like to address it, but I think sometimes we imagine memory sort of a bit cinematically, where it's like your eyeballs are the camera and there are facts and you're kind of rewatching or reliving something that happened. But the more we understand or learn about memory, the more we realize it's incredibly unreliable. Like your perspectives are changing, you make stuff up, someone incepts something and you think it happened and it didn't. And so I'm just curious how you thought about that in the context. I mean, this is a little bit of a question for Jenny, but I'm actually curious to hear from everyone about it, how it informed the work.
Well, yes, you're exactly right. And there's something kind of false about the idea that you can watch memories. What does that even mean? I mean, consciousness is not something you just see. So that's where I'm taking some creative liberties. But you're quite right. And there's one chapter, actually the one that I read to you from, Roxy decides to externalize her memory because she's having a very hard time and feels that her best days are behind her, and she wants to relive this trip that she took with her father to London when she was a teenager, kind of from that period she was remembering in that part. And so she externalizes her memory, and she feels this tremendous sense of lightness because she feels almost like some overcrowded space has been finally removed from her. Her head feels clearer, but she ultimately decides not to watch or revisit that trip from her father's. She decides not to see again her memories of that trip because she realizes that she's afraid that they won't be as good as as the memory she has made of it. So she's afraid of being disappointed and disillusioned, and she has so little, really, in her present-day life that she feels this hesitation of letting this beautiful memory be changed by, without all of that editing that you describe.
Right.
Hello. I feel like both of your work is so much about the dissonance between being a modern person with a soul and the sort of machinated, automated life that we live in. Sheila, you are so much about women being considered an automated machine. Stings very differently these days than it did even a couple years ago. But I'm curious for both of you if your writing has informed your relationship with modern technology or vice versa, or how it's changed your relationship with technology.
Maybe in using the audio function on your phone to record yourself.
Sorry?
I said, but using the audio function on the phone to record yourself, maybe?
Oh yeah, well, for me when I hear technology, I just think about like the internet and social media. Like, I don't know, I mean, I don't have an answer for this question, do you?
Yeah, I mean, I find that as a citizen, I guess, I'm very wary of technology. I'm a late adopter. I'm not good at figuring out machines. I tend to do it wrong. So I'm not, and I don't have a lot of curiosity about it. Like, I'm not interested in shiny new devices. I'm terrified that it will take me forever to learn to use them, and I just stick with the one I have until it dies. And I feel deeply concerned about all of the obvious things that are worrisome about technology. But as a fiction writer, I'm totally fascinated by it. Yeah, I feel like it gives me ideas for forms that I want to use. I read about technology always thinking, how can I use that? Like when I finally understood what a blockchain was, which was so exciting, and it actually didn't seem as complicated as I thought it would be. I immediately thought, oh, that's so interesting. The idea that you can see every place that there's a trace of every hand, as it were, that touches this. I immediately thought there has to be a way to use that to write fiction. I've made no progress on that front. But I'm always thinking, how can I use this? How can I grab it and sort of bend it to my own purposes? And I'm so interested in the way it interacts with people's lives, and since the job of the fiction writer is to write about people and sort of how they think and live, it feels totally fascinating to me to look carefully at what's happening technologically around me.
I mean, I'm always interested to know what happens with technology. I don't have that fear of new things, but now I have like this massive concern about what's going to happen, not just, obviously from a citizenship perspective, but also just from a consciousness perspective, like what's going to happen to our lives. We already are like experiencing the world in such different ways, and that's being reflected in the fiction that we write. So, yes, final question, I think.
Oh no, I didn't want to be the final question. I really wanted to ask you about the word ejaculation, Sheila, because of that being such a central word in the middle of the book. And then as I was listening to you, both of you speak, it seemed like another word came up in relation to memory, which was omission. And I was so struck, especially hearing about how you would write orally, that you didn't end up omitting ejaculation, because it's so purple in the middle of that book. Like, first of all, it has to do with your dad. Like, it does.
So purple?
Yeah, to me, it's like it's standing alone, going like, "Here I am," and you say it again. Like, you say the word several times, and it's my book club read the book together, and nobody could understand except me intuitively why you would use that word. But then I wanted to just ask more generally, I guess for both of you, because Jennifer, I've also really enjoyed your writing. Like, how do you work with omission and the significance of it in your text? Because I think it plays a huge role. You're giving readers massive lacunae to fill in each of those spaces, but you don't give the creepiness of the relationship of the father as a place for the reader to fill in themselves. You force this forward. And so it would be something that I think could have been omitted, but I'm so glad you didn't. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. I have got this question about this word before. In the book, I say that the universe, so Mira's holding her father as he dies, and then I say that she felt the universe ejaculate his spirit into her. And that was just my experience. And so, and that was the word of that was the best word. That was what happened. And I felt like I didn't think of it as like sexual. It's just a metaphor. It suggests a kind of propulsiveness, a suddenness, something biological, something natural. I wasn't thinking like people are going to be thinking that there's like an incest theme. But I guess it was like a confusing word for people. But I wouldn't write it any differently. Because I just don't think there's another word like that.
The omission question, or the omission part of that question, I would say that in a way, fiction is mostly omission. We're trying to create something relatively small that suggests the enormity of the world around us and human perception. And so, density and compression are the most important elements. I mean, I'm always thinking, how little can I do to suggest the most? And if I feel any repetition, if I have a sense of something not pushing things forward, I cut it because I'm always trying to reduce it to the absolute minimum and then move on and do more. So omission is a really natural part of the process. And what I feel like I'm trying to hold myself to at every level, starting with the sentence, is just, are we moving forward? Are we in a different place at the end of the sentence than we were before? And is it a place that we haven't already done in a previous sentence? And that measuring and that questioning is part of what helps me achieve, I hope, some kind of compression that suggests something much, much larger than what's there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation. I so enjoyed speaking with both of you. Please give them a round of applause.